Good day, me again from the cheap seats. The other day, the Conservatives with Pierre Poilievre had a town hall meeting, and a very, very good question, a fundamental question, was brought up by one of the audience. I would like to comment on Pierre's answer to that. But here's the question.
Looking to the future, the issues that really scare me are like social and cultural issues. It seems that we're, divided so heavily along these cultural lines that just sort of happen to the very edges fit into our political landscape. How do you plan to communicate the platform that you're bringing forward to the country in such a way that you can unite the cultural aspects of the issues that are coming your way?
But you should know the country that you live in.
So he basically asks Pierre Poilievre, how are you going to make a difference in a culture that is broken, which seems to be divided and doesn't really have answers? How are you going to make a difference? And Mr. Poilievre answers this way.
How do we put the pieces back together? The answer is freedom.
Mr. Poilievre answers he wants to give back freedom. The problem is he doesn't put it in a context. He uses a quote from Wilfrid Laurier, the Prime Minister of Canada, the 7th Prime Minister of Canada, I believe, but he doesn't put it in a context. He doesn't frame it. The other problem is that the man in the audience asks how he will make a difference, and although Pierre Poilievre says he's going to give freedom, the progressive conservatives are really no different than the liberals in their worldview. They're progressive. They're no different than the liberals. They are only running at 60 miles an hour, so they're running their agenda slower than the liberals. But let's let Pierre continue.
When Wilfrid Laurier was asked what is Canada's nationality 100 years ago, he couldn't answer based on the way most national leaders could.
So here, Pierre Poilievre quotes Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, who was having a speech in 1905 in Edmonton. This was happening when Alberta and Saskatchewan became part of the Dominion of Canada. Wilfrid Laurier at the time was pointing out that those who wanted to become Canadian citizens basically had to adopt the Canadian institutions. But let's continue with Pierre's speech.
If you had been in Europe, you would have answered based on ethnicity or religion. From France, you would have said French. In England, you would have said English. But in Canada, we were already mixed up.
This is where I believe Pierre Poilievre does a little bit of history revisionism. He's going to frame it in such a way, he's going to frame his answer to the member of the audience in such a way that it'll sound neutral, it'll sound as if there's no religion in the answer. But you have to remember that he's quoting Wilfrid Laurier shortly after Confederation, and the Confederate fathers, our Canadian Confederate fathers, of which 36 are listed, 30 were Protestant and 6 were Roman Catholic. They did not, in many ways, when you read history, they didn't want to have politics mixed, or governments mixed with church and government mixed. They wanted that separated. And that's a good thing. But the one thing that people don't seem to realize you can't separate morality and government. And I believe this is what Pierre, Poilievre, and the Conservatives, like the Liberals, are trying to do. They're trying to separate morality from the government. Impossible.
We had obviously the First Peoples, we had French, English, we had Scots, Irish, Germans, we even had Asian peoples who were here at that time. And so he couldn't answer based on race or gender or ideology or any of those things. He said, Canada is free and freedom is its nationality.
So he goes on to say that Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. He quotes Wilfrid Laurier, and that's nice and that's good. And he also points out that there were all these different nationalities from different countries. But what he's not pointing out, and I don't know why we as a Canadian people don't know this or are simply going to ignore it, but he doesn't point out that Canada has a history of predominantly being Protestant and Roman Catholic, Quebec and the rest of Canada. Why is that so difficult to even want to point out? It's the way it is. Protestant, Roman Catholic. So to make the statement that Wilfrid Laurier made, and for Pierre Poilievre to quote it, and not tying it to the context that Wilfrid lived in, is Pierre Poilievre revising history. It is showing that he's no different than the Liberals, except his agenda is slower. But he makes a few interesting comments yet. Let's listen.
And that's why Protestants and Catholics gouged each other's eyes out for centuries in Europe. And then they came to Canada and lived peacefully. Why? Because Catholics were able to worship freely, Protestants were able to worship freely.
Here's my concern, and it's part of a larger concern that people's best qualities are leveraged against them. And that what unscrupulous people in power do, if they're smart, is they don't dispatch an army of young men in tight uniforms to goose step through your town because it's a little bit too obvious. You've seen that movie. And you sort of know what happens next. You take up arms, you form a resistance, you drive the people out, and freedom returns, right? You guys have seen that movie. It's been done about 50,000 times. And oh, if only that's what we were facing. Because that is straightforward. That's the kind of masculine expression of fascism.
Pierre Poilievre points out that in Europe for centuries they were gouging each other's eyes out. He insinuates that that's a problem with religion. What he doesn't point out is that when Wilfrid Laurier and others were building our country, they were not just building it on nothing. Wilfrid Laurier and the Confederate Fathers, let's call them, of which, like I said, 30 were Protestant and 6 were Roman Catholic. There were no agnostics or atheists or anything like that among them, which is completely different than the way the United States was formed. These men had religious and historical backgrounds which had taught them that you could not leave morality out of society. And that is the question of this young fella in the audience that he's not answering. How are you going to bind a culture together? Well, you can't bind it together by building houses. That's not going to do it. I'm sorry, it's not. And sending money to mothers and fathers for daycare is simply not going to do it either. What will do it is a foundation that the people agree on. And that's the way they built this country. Wilfrid Laurier was alive and well when the government buildings, the parliament buildings were being built. 26 Bible texts in that building. And while he was still living, he could have seen that. We don't read anywhere of any of these men that may have still been alive that they didn't want that. Because they understood that you could not separate morality from a government. It is simply impossible. And it is beyond me why Canadians cannot understand that or don't want to understand that. Wilfrid Laurier was pressured very much by his church to push the Roman Catholic religion. This was not the case with the Protestants. What they both wanted, though, was a morality in government. What you see Pierre Poilievre do is deny that aspect. It's just not there.
And the times in our history where we have made mistakes and where we have done wrong has been when the government has become too powerful and has taken away the freedom and the autonomy of the people. In every instance, all the historical wrongs in our history are the result of government using excessive force and power over the population.
That he wants to restore freedom, that's good. That's all well and good. But it's not for him to restore. It's an inherent right given by God, which Wilfrid Laurier and I think most of those men in those years knew very well, because Wilfrid Laurier, in the same speech, compares Canada to the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, he does. You can check it out. He compares Canada to the kingdom of heaven. The right of man to be free is granted by God. It's given by God, and it needs to be acknowledged as such. That unites a people.
But by restoring freedom, we allow each individual, each group, each family, each community to live the lives that they choose to live.
If by now you don't see that he is no different than the Liberals, he says that he can restore freedoms. The people, you need to understand that is not for him to restore. If that was for him to restore, then it's for him to take away. That's what we've got with the Liberals. It's going to go back and forth. Trudeau thinks he can take it away. Pierre Poilievre thinks he can give it back. It's just a back and a forth. There is no difference, and it's not an answer to the man in the audience.
And in so doing, there's no reason to fight because everyone can do what they believe right. My purpose in politics is not to take power, but to give it back. To have a small government with big citizens. To have a government, if I were to start a new political party from scratch, it would be called the Mind Your Own Damn Business Party. Where the government does its job, which is to provide roads and schools and hospitals, and national security, protect the environment, and then let people live their lives.
So if by now you don't see that this is a non-answer to the man in the audience, he wants to give back freedoms to the people. Great. And then he says he wants to take care of schools and roads and hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Can someone please tell me what the difference is between that and what the Liberals are doing? So he wants to bring that back. Well, I can tell you, it looks to me like he wants to go back to the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s. That's not a solution. That's absolutely not the solution. He will not address the moral issues that need to be underlying a government. It's got nothing to do with church and state. It's got everything to do with the morality of the people in the government. And he also does not bring that out. He won't.
Make their own decisions, think their own thoughts, spend their own money, worship God in their own way, express their own values with their own words. I am not here to run your life. I'm not even here to run a country. I'm here to run a government that does a few things well rather than a lot of things poorly and allows free people to live and prosper and fulfill their full potential. That is my purpose. Let's make it happen. Let's bring it home.
Freedom, as expressed in the French Revolution, do whatever we want. Haul out the guillotine if you don't like your neighbor. Is that what he wants? I don't think he wants that. I don't think anybody wants that. Why not? Because there are inherent, inalienable rights given by God that cannot be taken away and upon which all countries, laws, and governments must be based. It's as simple and as easy as that. And until we get that right, we will have nothing but going back and forth, heading to the abyss. So let's bring that home.
But the West is now facing a far slyer opponent, which is the feminine expression of fascism, the Chrystia Freeland version of fascism. Yes, yes.